Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome again to our webinar, one of our autumn, well, probably winter now, webinars we've been running for some time. This is obviously the last one of 2023, and an interesting topic pre-Christmas, reimagining the landlord-tenant relationship in agriculture. And I'm quite encouraged, and I'm hoping that what we're going to hear this evening is some really good practice and some examples of how landlords and tenants relationships really work well together, so we can have an uplifting message as we all head off into Christmas and the new year. So no pressure on our speakers tonight to deliver us some uplifting news. So that will be really interesting. Just the usual bit of thanks initially to Oxbury Bank, who are once again sponsoring our webinar sessions. For those of you who don't know, and I'm sure many of you do now, because Oxbury have been kindly sponsoring these events for throughout the year, but they're the sort of new kids on the block. They were founded in 2021 by bankers, farmers and technologists, and are the only 100% bank 100% dedicated to serving farmers, food producers in the rural economy. And as of 2 days ago, I can confirm they are extremely good to deal with, having just recently opened a bank account with them. So that was quite good. It was all very smooth, and we seem to have some money in it, which is unusual in our bank history. So it's good to see that they're sponsoring us. And for anybody that doesn't know about them, I'd really encourage you to find out a bit more. Go on their website, and as I say, thank you for them for sponsoring it. As always, the webinar is recorded, and it will be available on our TFA YouTube channel, which is @Tenant Farmers, and also via our website. And just to remind you that all of our webinars that we've run through the year are on that channel. So, and most recently we've done ones around the new Elm schemes after SFI. Last month about the choices facing tenant farmers in the next 12 months. We've covered new entrants and various topics around the natural capital and carbon and one thing and another. So if you haven't had a chance or you weren't there to see them initially, then please go and take a look. Anyway, moving on to this evening, we are really privileged, I think, to be joined tonight by Paul Sedgwick, who's the Deputy Ranger and Managing Director of Windsor and the Rural Crown Estate, and Alistair Martin, who's the Secretary and Keeper of Records at the Duchy of Cornwall. Both obviously operating big, large institutional landowners, and I think we're going to learn how that relationship between their tenants and them as landowners really has been made to work. And George Dunn, who you will all know as our Chief Executive, will join us for Q&As later. But George and I were privileged to be taken around the Windsor estate by Paul earlier in the summer and to learn a little bit more about what the Crown are doing with their rural portfolio. So it'll be interesting to hear from Paul this evening, and I think you'll find a lot of what you're going to hear really valuable. Alistair's been at the the Duchy of Cornwall for some time. Joined there in 2013, so yeah, 10 years now. So, and has worked across property disciplines, valuation, development throughout his career. And I think certainly my experience as the chair of the TFA and meeting up with Alistair and learning about what the Duchy does. Again, it's a really good example in so many ways of how landlords and tenants relationship can be made to work in a mutually beneficial way. And I think when we talk about good collaborative relationships, the danger is we think that it's just all in our favour as tenants. I think the key thing about these relationships is that they're mutually a good relationship, and we have a part to play and a responsibility to our landlords to deliver and work with them too. So I'm really looking forward to what I think we're going to hear tonight from Paul and Alistair. So thank you both for joining us. been giving up your time this evening. I don't think George needs much introduction. I think most of you are aware George has been the Chief Executive of the TFA for nearly 27 years, after working in the Ministry of Agriculture, the old MAF, and previously for the CLA prior to joining the TFA. And as you'll know, George represents the TFA and the tenanted sector throughout the industry extremely well. So it'll be good to have George here for some of the questions. A couple of things just before we get started. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A box, and I would encourage you to put questions in there. As always, we've had a few questions submitted prior to the evening. I'll apologise already because we won't get through all the questions. We never have done. So, I mean, we might be different tonight. Who knows? It might be different, but I suspect not. But I'm sure Paul and Alistair will be willing to answer offline some of those questions, and we'll put them on the website like we've done previously. So I think, yeah, just please put your Q&A questions in the Q&A box if you can. So I think without further ado, we'll get cracking. First, we're going to hear from Paul Sedgwick, who, as we say, looks after the rural estate for the Crown and the Windsor estate. So, Paul, thank you very much for joining us. Good evening, and we're looking forward to some inspirational news.
No pressure. Mark, thank you. George, thank you as well. And good evening, everybody, and thank you for kindly inviting me to speak to you this evening. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes about the Crown estate, its rural portfolio, and the emerging journey that we're on with our new strategy, and how we are seeking to try and tackle some of the challenges facing our farming community at the moment. Alistair will no doubt talk about the Duchy journey in a minute, and I think, you know, we as the Crown estate are very much on catch up at the moment with the Duchy. They've been the pioneers in this space for many years, and the Crown, I think, for certainly a fair period of time has been quite absent from discussions such as one we're having this evening, predominantly because we were on very much an exit strategy from our rural portfolio for many years because of our restrictions over borrowing as an organisation and our ability that we couldn't raise capital to fund projects across our wider portfolio. But just as a little bit of background, the Crown estate came into existence in 1760 when King George III reached an agreement with Parliament. He surrendered the majority of the Crown lands to the nation in return for an annual payment, which for many years was known as the civil list, and in recent times is now known as the sovereign grant. So the Crown returns every year all its net revenue surplus, its profits, to Treasury for the benefit of the nation. So slightly tongue-in-cheek, we're probably one of the few organisations in the country that pays 100% tax. We have a new purpose that as an organisation is really key to us, and that is to create lasting and shared prosperity for the nation. We have some unique attributes to the Crown in terms of our long-term ownership, our unique fiscal position because of the fact that we don't pay capital taxes, and we have an independence, a simplicity, and a trusted brand that would march hand in hand with organisations such as the Duchy as well. But as part of our strategy as an organisation, we're really leaning into trying to support the country in three key areas. Firstly, leading in the net zero transition, and that is particularly where our marine estate comes to bear with all the offshore wind turbines. We want to help create thriving communities, both in London, where we have a lot of real estate, and across the regions. And thirdly, to take a leading role in stewarding the natural environment and biodiversity. Now, these three key objectives really lead to the way in which we look at value creation. If we just move on to the next slide, Julia. So this is really important to us, and it's really important to our rural estates, because in the past, under the Crown Estate Act, we were obliged to obtain best value, and we still are. But that value was set purely against financial metrics. And now we have a much more balanced value creation framework around social, environmental, and financial outputs. And of course, for rural estates, for farms, etc., that levels up the playing field hugely, particularly around the environmental and social aspects. If we go on to the next slide. In terms of our rural portfolio, geographically, it is very diverse, from Northumberland to Kent to Wales to Somerset, and a lot of land in between. Very crudely, if you exclude Windsor from this conversation, we are about 180,000 acres of land. 2/3 of that is agricultural land, 60,000 acres of AHAs, 60,000 acres of FBT, and about 60,000 acres of upland commons in Wales and Cumbria, and then a myriad of strategic housing land, residential property, a little bit of forestry, and renewable energy. But what's interesting about this is that 21% of our land area are priority habitats, particularly in the Welsh uplands. So if we move on. Particularly if you start to look at, if we go on to the next slide, Julia. Thanks. Some of our social value contributions and environmental contributions, a lot of public access, a lot of communities, a lot of jobs based on the estates that we look after around the country. From an environmental perspective, we are across the portfolio net emitters of carbon, about 190,000 tonnes. We have very limited tree cover. When you look at our portfolio, if you include Windsor, it increases a bit, but that is an area that we need to work on. And we have a small but growing portfolio of renewable energy opportunities. So to the next slide. So what are we looking to do? We have refocused our strategy from a disposal strategy to a long-term retention strategy. We want to be seen as one of the leading exemplars of large-scale integrated agri-environmental best practice. We have ground to catch up. We are very much aware of that. But we're very key to this is keeping food production at the core of our strategy. And I think that's a really key message that we want to land. We are still very much about farming and our farmers and their future. But some of the things we're looking at doing around large-scale land management will cause, I think, an element of disruption and a little bit of discomfort within the more traditional institutional let farm model. What we're really looking at is system change, and system change at scale. So our portfolio at the moment would very much look like the portfolio on the left-hand side. It is predominantly primary agricultural production. We have a very large percentage of grade 1 and grade 2 land. And I suspect when Alistair talks to you in a minute, you know, the Duchy will have a different makeup of their portfolio as well. And what we're seeking to do is really pivot the portfolio to a mixture of diversification, agroforestry, renewable energy, nature recovery, and regen farming, where appropriate to soil type. And that's really a key point, because we have some very, very high quality double cropping veg land on our portfolio and things like that, which of course we need to keep food production at the core and part of the main focus of what we're doing. So if we move on, Julia. So how are we tackling this? This is not necessarily the right answer, but it is our answer to the challenge of how we pivot our portfolio to lean into some of the challenges that as an industry we are facing. So we've got 4 pillars to our strategy. Pillar 1 is around simply optimizing the asset management performance across the estates. That's leading to some quite interesting conversations with our farmers about what buildings are used for, what cottages are used for, and what land is used for. But the underlying key message coming out of this is that the viability and resilience of our farming community is absolutely vital to the future of our land holdings. And that is a sort of non-negotiable in our book. We want to move from a very arm's length landowner, I think quite a passive landowner, to a more active asset manager of land and property. And we have a very significant size of the prize. We've identified that we have about £45 million a year of latent non-farming income in the portfolio, and we need to unlock it quickly and at scale, working in partnership with our farming community, because part of this is key to their future success as well. In the context of Pillar 2, we want to take a leading role in the delivery of the green agriculture transition. We are putting in place a new environmental FBT across all our FBT land. That will be with a term of 15 years. And that is incentivizing the farmers to really adopt low carbon farming models. And as part of that, we have been quite open with our farmers that we are open to accepting lower rents for better environmental outcomes, which I think is been a position that I think a lot of institutions have been quite hesitant to take it going forward. But inevitably, this is not the panacea for all, and we appreciate that, but we are taking it forward across our estates with a really engaged group of farmers who are leaning into this challenge going forward. In terms of leading in the delivery of nature recovery, as I touched on earlier, 21% of our land is priority habitats, so triple SIs, SPAs, etc. And we are quite focused on getting those back into favourable condition, and that is going to be quite a challenge for us to do. But we're also seeking to repurpose 15% of our farmland into habitat enhancement. And that is at the moment very much farmer-led. So we are setting some guardrails, some guidelines around what farmers can do. We landed on 15% because many of our farming community will remember the old set-aside figures from the McSharry time. But what's been fascinating is that by setting and understanding the parameters in which the farming community on the Crown estates operate, is that actually once you create the right environment for this, the uptake and conversion of this land into environmental enhancement has caught us slightly by surprise. So we put in place quite a significant capital fund to help our farmers take this forward through no regrets environmental moves, so hedge planting, small copse creation, pond restoration, etc. And the take up on that has been very, very significant. And in the first 2 years, we've put in 185 kilometres of new hedgerows. We've got 300 acres of new woodland going in the ground in the next few months. And that is working out at about £2 million a year. It sounds a very sizable sum of money, but when you break it down across our portfolio, it's £10 an acre per year. And I think as a landlord, that is the bare minimum that we should be putting in to the biodiversity challenge. But equally, the availability of forestry grants and other grants has been very significant as well, and we're making use of those. And then the fourth pillar is really about replenishing our portfolio. A lot of land was sold over the last decade, and a lot of land that we now need to get the right balance within our portfolio needs to be reassessed. If we move on to the next slide. So how are we going to do this in reality and on the ground? We are creating environmental plans for each estate we own and master plans. We've looked at all the asset management opportunities in a no tenant world. So we've looked at it initially with removing all the farmers from our land and buildings and houses, seeing what the size of the prize is, and then reintroducing the tenancy structure to that to see what the joint opportunities are. It is requiring a change of mindset from both landlord and tenant. But what's interesting is we've met very, very little resistance to that conversation. I think working in partnership and moving away from some of the more, I think, turgid models of standard FBTs, etc., is really, really important. We're putting in place 2 contract farming arrangements with farmers instead of tenancies. We have a farming partnership that we run in Northumberland with Felcourt. We don't, as an organisation, have a desire to become in-hand farmers, before anyone asks that question. But what we want to do is look at models that get away from some of the friction points that exist at present between landlord and tenant. But equally, we realise that a lot of our farmers are much better businessmen and women than we will ever be. And leveraging their acumen, the sense of urgency that they have around diversifying their businesses, I think creates a really powerful opportunity for us, where we can deploy our capital alongside their acumen to get better outcomes. And equally, we want to create income stacking across our farms to de-risk the exposure to fluctuations in primary agricultural markets. Equally, we are super keen to see the next generation of farmers coming through. On some of our estates, we've got some really, really progressive young farmers. But equally, we've got a number of sort of older generation farmers that need to let the younger generation come through now, because there's a lot of idea and there's a lot of energy coming from those generations. I've touched on the Environment Fund and some of the early uptake that we've had from our farming community. What's interesting is, from a standing start, the creation of these new hedgerows particularly has caught us slightly on the hop. It certainly caught quite a few of the hedgerow plant suppliers on the hop when you want 185 kilometres of new hedgerow. But this has all been farmer-led. This has not been put on them by us. What we have done is we've tried to create some guardrails and some guidelines from which they can operate, and that has met some early success. I think moving on to our environmental FBT, once we get a final document, and George is looking at that as a critical friend for us, we are going to share the EFBT, as we're calling it, alongside the Green Book, which is the environmental plan, and we're going to share that. If people want to see it, if the industry wants to use it or amend it, make it better, criticize it, it's our idea around how we can try and make a difference. And I know that the Duchy have been doing a similar thing for many, many years. And these things work. And what we're finding is that more positive engagement, farmer to crown, and with our managing agents as well, is really helping to unlock some of these opportunities. So just move on to the next slide. So we've spoken about the Environment Fund and the creation of the new woods. They were very much part of a plan to celebrate Her Majesty's Jubilee, and a lot of those are going on the ground as we speak. The hedgerows, that will continue, and I'm sure that the Crown will continue to make funding available alongside capital grants as well. Julia, if we go to the next one. So just an example, we've been planting a lot of non-Windsor hedges, which are the sort of what I call the traditional 3-metre wide hedge that you see on a lot of farms. These have been dubbed the Windsor hedge. His Majesty, as Ranger at Windsor, was quite instrumental in the design of these hedgerows. So double rows with tree standards down the middle. They're fenced off, predominantly to stop deer browsing, particularly at Windsor. We have large deer numbers. But what's interesting is a huge uptake in this bigger hedge as a wildlife corridor across our rural portfolio. There's a huge amount of these going in and being fenced off and making a real difference. So Julia, if we move on. So that change of mindset I spoke about, the environmental FBT, this isn't a panacea for all, as I touched on earlier. You know, we have got a real mixture of land geographically and soil type across our portfolio. And I think what we're just trying to do, as I touched on earlier, is create a safe space for a conversation to take place. They might not always be good conversations, but but there's still a conversation. And that is where I think these things all start from moving forward. Jude, if we go on to the next one. And then just to summarize, really to end my talk, it's really just to pull it back to where we were and where we're trying to move to. And I think what I've been really taken aback by, having had a sort of 30-year career in land agency, of where early career as a young land agent, you're relatively obsessed with farm rents that you achieve and rent reviews and things like that. Now, I think the whole landscape has changed. Rents are important. They help pay the bills, but they're not the be-all and end-all. And I think for us now, it is around how we move into the nature recovery space, the diversification space, and how we enable a partnership relationship to exist between ourselves, our very engaged and superb farming community that we have across the Crown Estate, and how we make them a success for the future. Because if we can make them a success, then we make ourselves a success. And that, if we can then scale that out across rural estates or smaller portfolios, then, and we can learn lessons along the way and share good stories and bad stories and experiences, both from ourselves and probably the Duchy as well, then I think we will have done our bit to help in this challenging time. So thank you very much.
Paul, thank you. That's really interesting, and there's so many points you make in there, but I think the overriding thing is this idea of a collaboration and partnership, and the partnership between you as the landowner and the tenant as the farmer. And so many of your schemes appearing now to be sort of farmer-led is really, it's a bit of a breath of fresh air, I think, for many of us. I think it's really good to hear, and no doubt there'll be a few more questions around that when we come back to the Q&A. So, but thanks very much for that, Paul. Really interesting. So we're going to move on to Alistair, who I said is responsible for running the Duchy of Cornwall. Prior to being at the Duchy, Alistair was qualified as a land agent and chartered surveyor in private practice for 30 years and has worked across a lot of these disciplines. He's also has various trustee and non-executive appointments, including being the chairman of the Duchy of Lancaster's Rural Committee, and was a member of the ROC Review on tenancy, the Tenancy Working Group last year. So Alistair has a real wealth of knowledge around landlord-tenant relationships and how best to make these work. So over to you, Alistair, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Mark, very much. So first, I just got one or two slides just to which we'll run through in a moment. But if I can just first of all describe the purpose of the Duchy for those who are not familiar with it. We exist to provide an income for the heir to the throne and have done so for almost 700 years. So we have a commercial imperative. And I always start any talk about, well, I've got my Duchy hat on in saying that, in that we are subject to Treasury oversight and we are required to operate in a commercial context, as indeed are the Crown. In terms of the wider Duchy estate is not just the rural. The rural's our most visible manifestation, but the rural estate is about half our capital value and generates about a quarter of our net income, although it does provide the bedrock for a lot of other things we do in terms of development and so forth. In terms of our geography, we're a little bit more tightly arranged than the Crown, although not much more. We've got about 140,000 acres in total, of which almost 60,000 is upland. We are spread across 20 counties of England, although predominantly we're in the southwest of England. So Cornwall up to Herefordshire is really where most of the land holdings are. In contrast to the Crown, and this is relevant to something I'm going to talk about in a moment, we would have a much higher proportion of livestock units. We are mixed farms, but we don't have that many arable. We've got a bit of arable in Wiltshire and Herefordshire, a little bit everywhere, but we are much more livestock oriented. And in terms of our management resource, and again, this is relevant to what I'm going to talk about, we manage in-house all of our land agency resource, and for that matter, a lot of the other resource that we now provide for our farm tenants are provided internally. We rarely go externally. Our principals, formerly the 24th Duke of Cornwall, now King Charles, now the 25th Duke, Prince William, have taken a very close interest in the estate. And that's a good thing in my view. It's the rural estates have a high priority in what we've done. And I hope that we have done and will continue to do things that please them. So we actually started auditing our natural capitals about 5 years ago. We knew that the whole subsidy regime was going to change with Brexit. So we've undertaken baseline audits on all of our farms now at no cost to our tenants, I might say. I know not all landlords would do that, but we've developed a map. It's a bespoke software system which our tenants can use so that every farm has had a baseline audit done of its natural capitals, which we hope will help them. The other thing I just want to explain is that at the same time as preparing for the new farm subsidy regime, we have been preparing for a fairly meaningful journey towards net zero for the whole estate, not just the rural estate. So we emit, interestingly, slightly more net carbon than the Crown Estate. We emit just over 200,000 tonnes of carbon a year. Of that, 62% comes from our farming activities, all by our tenants, and 24% from our degraded peatland. So that's 86% in total of our net emissions comes from our rural estate. So that has become a real focus for us in working with our tenants in how we might moderate that. Julia, can I have the next slide? So we believe in a close landlord-tenant relationship. I've said already that we do have an internal resource. I'm not going to go through all of these points. To pick out one or two, we're quite proud of the fact that our average term for our equipped farms for an FBT is 21 years. You know, George has beaten the drum for a long time to have longer FBTs. We have a dedicated future farming team of advisors. These are not land agents. These are mostly specialist ecologists and conservationists who work with our land agency team and our farmers to help them in looking at their options and particularly in interpreting natural capital plans. And we, for example, with SFIs, we've helped our tenants work to putting in SFIs. And I asked our head of future farming this afternoon, and she estimates that about a third of our tenants so far have entered SFI, and we hope another third will enter next year. Next slide, please, Julia. Investment in farm infrastructure, machinery and equipment. We try and invest where we can. Our capital is precious. There isn't a limitless supply and we have to prioritise. We do provide independent expert from some other industry experts beyond the internal bods I've talked about, and that's particularly on cow nutrition and on hydrology. Carbon auditing is probably worth me just explaining. We initially did a desktop assessment in order to assess what our net carbon emissions were. We did a desktop assessment initially of all our rural estate. We've then gone to whole farm carbon footprints on it. That's farm by farm. We've used the farm carbon toolkit to do that. We visited all farms. We've done soil sampling, and we've also done modelling with a business called Downforce Technology, which is a satellite modelling technology just to work out where our main carbon emissions are. Because we need to now work with our farm tenants to try and reduce the carbon emissions. And that is not going to be easy because our farm tenants clearly are perfectly entitled to what the lawyers call peaceable occupation. So we can't tell them how to farm, providing they're farming in a legal and responsible way. But what we can do is work with them and try and take them with us on our journey. And I've long believed that at the moment, there's a certain amount of push from us to our tenants to reduce their emissions. But I think the pull from the markets that those tenants are supplying their food to will become the overriding dynamic, and it'll become more pull than push as time goes on. And we want to prepare our guys for that. It's probably worth me just mentioning mental health and wellbeing service. This is something which the 25th Duke, Prince William, is particularly keen on. And we have now rolled out quite recently a number of services for our farm tenants. And you people will know that the rate of suicide in farming is depressingly high. And we are very well aware of that. In fact, one of our farm tenants actually established a charity himself called We Are Farming Minds, specifically for farmers. It was originally aimed just at the Herefordshire market, which is where he farms. And in fact, and again, George will know this from his previous FCN days and his interest in this subject. But when I took Prince William there in September, we'd already had 4 farming suicides in Herefordshire alone this year. So we are trying our best. We recognise these are really challenging times for farmers to help in that respect. So we've got a 24/7 phone line through a company we've outsourced to, but we've also been working with FCN and RABI and other farm charities because that is important to us. Next slide, please. And last slide, Julia. And the final thing I just want to say within my 10 minutes is that what we've done is we've established a number of focus farms around the Duchy, and you'll see them on that map there. That is where most of our, in that southwest peninsula, most of our farms are. And we've tried to sprinkle the focus farms around so that we've got them both geographically spread, but also spread between the different disciplines of dairy, general livestock, arable, and so forth. And the idea of these focus farms is that we invite our other tenants to them so that they can see from the focus farmers who are given enhanced support from us exactly how our move to persuade them to farm more regeneratively is actually working out financially, because that's what you guys are interested in, quite correctly. And Mark, I think that's probably my 10 minutes done. Thank you.
Alistair, thank you. That's really interesting as ever to hear what the Duchy are doing. And of course, you've been on this journey way ahead of the curve compared to most of us, I think, in terms of spotting where things were going. And so the experience that you've got and the knowledge that you've been able to impart to tenants, I think, overall the whole estate is probably, absolutely invaluable. So, yeah, thank you very much for that. And interesting to hear about the health and mental health and well-being offer as well. It's a bit sad that it has to be necessary, but it absolutely is. And I think some of these, we hear some really tragic stories of where people are really under pressure because of, I guess, the uncertainty that we're all under at the moment, and the various pulls on our time, and what I think some people get very overwhelmed with what we're trying to deliver, whether it's food or for the environment or carbon or whatever we have to deliver. So it's great to have that support available, and there are obviously various charities around, but it's good to see that's coming from the landowners too. So thanks very much for that. Okay, so I think we'll crack on. We'll head on to Q&A, and I'll invite George to join us at this stage and pick up maybe some of the questions as well. I think most of these are pretty much there's a view from everybody, but as we go along, we'll identify those. Not unsurprisingly, I guess we'll pick up on some of the ones that have been sent in prior to the evening. But particularly, I suppose, 2 aspects to this is the first one is a member from Yorkshire who says, obviously interested to hear the views, but how do they view the relationship of the landlord and the tenant? But particularly, do they see it as an equal partnership, which is quite interesting, because I think the more equal you can get these things, the better. But clearly there is an imbalance, and there's I think, Paul, you described it as you've got the capital and we've got the acumen. I mean, very, very kind of you to say we've got some acumen, but it's that combination that I think is important. But yeah, I'd be interested in your views on that. How do you make that equal, or is it equal?
Shall I go first, Mark?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, yes, of course, it should be, but I'm sure it doesn't always look that way. And obviously, landlords and tenants have a different perspective. Landlords have certain reservations, and also there are provisions in many tenancy agreements as to how the tenant should operate. So the tenant might feel at times inhibited by that. But of course, the tenant is entitled to peaceable occupation, as I mentioned earlier. And to that extent, the landlord can sometimes be frustrated that they are not able to exercise more control in what happens on the farm. But I think there's bound to be a healthy tension between two. It would be surprising if there wasn't, frankly. But I would hope that a responsible landlord and a responsible tenant can work things out between them. So it should be equal, but I'm sure it doesn't always seem that way, Mark.
Yeah. Paul, what's your experience?
Yeah, I would echo what Alistair's saying. I think, the power for both parties to do good is quite tangible, and I've seen that through my career. Working on some lovely estates through my time, and now with the Crown, and particularly travelling around meeting our 400 farmers across the portfolio. They're massively engaged, and I have not met one that was not pleased to have the Crown on their farm. And I think for the big institutions, particularly, we can bring a scale and an opportunity going forward that I think others might not be able to. And I think the relationship, it touches on this sort of the power differential or perceived power differential, because I think that can sometimes race away to people's heads a bit, particularly wearing a landlord's hat. And I think that sort of humility and fairness that everyone has to bring. I mean, at the end of the day, Mark, it's your family home, it's your livelihood, and there's a massive moral responsibility that sits with the Crown, with the Duchy, to try and create that safe space for the conversations to happen. And as Alistair said, sometimes there is tension. That's understandable, but there's a great sort of business saying, from breakdowns come breakthroughs. And I think we're trying to move to a space now where we can have conversations, sometimes tricky ones, with our farmers, because we haven't got the luxury of the reputational relationship that the Duchy has built up over many, many years because of the Prince of Wales' stewardship of the portfolio, where we've been at the Crown quite institutionally hands-off. So there's a massive time investment that we need to bring to that relationship to I think to drive it forward. But in the 2 years I've been doing the rural portfolio outside my Windsor job, I would say that I've been welcomed with open arms by pretty much every farmer I've met.
Oh, that's good. That's good. You touched though on something there, Paul. You said you wonder whether the scale and both the Duchy and yourselves, you've got significant scale on a rural level. I wonder if it's easier. I'm sure you won't agree with me when I say it's easier, but I wonder if it's easier in your situations with the scale to resource up to deliver the sort of a really good landlord-tenant relationship, which perhaps some of the smaller estates, smaller, maybe more private landlords don't have, and that's possibly where we see the less good relations. And I'll ask George to comment on that in a moment. But I wonder whether both of you feel that the scale that you have allows you to resource things in a slightly more collaborative and a more helpful way for tenants than perhaps smaller operators might have.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mark, obviously we are able to we're able to establish and maintain a significant internal resource for liaison, but I think actually that's not the key thing. I think the key thing is actually a mindset thing. I think it's, do we want to work to our mutual benefit, or do we want to just throw stones at each other? And we very much want the former. We believe, I fervently believe in the landlord tenant system. I think that it's well proven over many years, and although various historic tax decisions have broken it down to some extent, I think that it is the best way of a farmer making the most of what capital he or she's got with their ability, and for a landowner to have their land stewarded in an appropriate way. So I think it's a mindset thing primarily, but the result does help.
Yeah.
And I touched on that in my talk about this need for a change in mindset.
Yeah.
But
I think that's really important for both sides, isn't it? I think sometimes, we're looking at this very much with our tenants hat on, obviously, but clearly, we have a part to play in changing mindset, particularly if we've been used to somebody that we might be considered to be very hands-off or not very collaborative with us. So, suddenly to have someone coming knocking on the door saying, I'd like to help, might be a bit of a shock, and it requires a change of mindset on our part as well, doesn't it? So I think I'm sure that's key.
Mark, can I just comment on that? So, going back to the previous question about equality, is it an equal relationship? I would actually disagree with Alistair and Paul. I don't think it is an equal relationship, because when you consider the size of both the Crown Estate and the Duchy of Cornwall, they're vastly superior to the amount of land that our members control on a day-to-day basis. It's a bit like, I remember that, I don't know whether you've seen that cartoon of three children trying to look at a football match over a fence, and they're each given a box to stand on, but even the shortest person can't see the match because the box is too short. So they're given equal treatment and given an equal box, but it's not until that short person gets two boxes that they can see over that fence. So my view is it's not about equality, it's about fairness. Is it a fair relationship? Is it fair that landlords are offering just very short-term agreements and nothing else? No, it's not. Is it fair that landlords are looking for the top dollar rent without putting money into for repairs? No, it's not. Is it fair that landlords are taking land away from tenant farmers to do other things so that they ruin their businesses? No, it's not. So it's about how we develop those collegiate, collaborative, fair relationships where people are valued equally, even though they come from very different perspectives from their lives. In terms of that question about scale, I've been involved with very large estates that have acted pretty poorly, and equally I've been involved with pretty small estates that have acted really well. I was on an estate a couple of weeks ago where I was invited to speak to their tenants' lunch, and clearly it was quite a small estate, and clearly there was a really good collegiate relationship on that estate. And Paul was very kind to say that the relationship we've had with the Crown previously has not been as good as it is now because of its decision to sort of exit from agriculture previously. Now it's not. So I don't think scale is the challenge. I think it's really about how we change the culture within the landlord tenant system so that we have fair and resilient relationships.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm sure that's right. Let me just pick up on a sort of similar question, but sort of slightly moving it on. I think we had a similar question to this in the pre-webinar questions, but Stephen Briggs asked in the chat. He said, clearly both the Crown and the Duchy are leading in progressive tenant-landlord relationships and shared ambitions. But how do we bring this to the wider land management and land agency industry to encourage more beneficial relationships to thrive? And I think this is quite key to how do we both as landlords and as tenants and representatives of those bodies, how do we encourage others who are perhaps less progressive and don't have quite the forward looking that you guys have got. How do we encourage that to happen? And I don't know that we know whether do you share this with other landlords? I wonder how that all works and how we can make that become more of the norm than the exception.
Well, I think it's up to you. I mean, George does quite a good job in doing the rounds of certainly all the larger estates and calling us to account. But I'm sure Paul is the same as me. But I have a number of speaking engagements through the year when I'm often speaking to landowners rather than tenants, and I would say exactly what I've said this evening, really, which is this is how we do it, and it works pretty well for us. And I think it's only through us all talking about it that people will know, because there will always be the bad landlords, there'll always be the bad tenants. I mean, that's just life. But there's a very big middle ground where people can actually change behaviours, and I would like to try and do my bit in helping changing landlords' behaviours. But actually, your best advocate is sitting here on this call, which is George, because he's the guy who's probably got a bigger black book than any of us, and he knows the people to ring, and he knows the people to get around a table, and we do that. And George and I sat on the rock reviews. You said in the Mark in the earlier intro, and there was a big debate about that, about badly behaved landlords, agents, and landlords, and the RICS are now doing a little bit about that at last, but we can just try and help make it better incrementally.
Yeah.
Mark, if I just build on that, I think the ability, the farms that Alice was talking about within the Duchy, where they're piloting a lot of this work, we're trying to do something similar with the Crown, and we want to take forward the Royal Ag Society of England's Farm of the Future report, which, if members haven't read it, it's a really good document about that journey to net zero in farming. But we want to, part of the idea of our environmental FBT is we won't get it 100% right. We want to share it with the industry and say, look, this is what we've done, rip it to pieces, shred it, do whatever you want. But it's an attempt at answering the question. And if that can engender, if some of the big organizations like the Duchies, the Crown, the National Trust, etc., can start this conversation and back it up with real case studies, with real data, with input from the farmers and the institutions, of saying, do you know what? Jumping off the cliff wasn't quite that scary. I think others will follow.
Yeah.
At least that's what we're hoping will happen. Because I think if we carry on doing what we're doing, I don't think the outcome is great.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're and we're going to publicly address this in the concept of saying, look, to get the right changes, the right environmental changes, the right benefits coming out of the tenancies, as a landlord of a diverse portfolio, you've got to be prepared to take a bit of a hit. And I think the progressive landlords will.
And Mark, just on that challenge about how we get other landlords, and I can see there's quite a lot of chat here about some of the imbalance in those relationships and some of the difficulties in relationships. And what I've always said to the likes of Alistair and Paul and other leaders on institutional estates is continue doing good, continue to develop those relationships, because the more that you continue to do good things, the more of a contrast there is with those that aren't doing good things. And the more we can bring them to account to say it doesn't have to be this way, it doesn't have to be difficult. There are good examples out there. And certainly, Alice has been very kind about the extent to which I and the TFA have called estates to account. But I can, in my 27 years of the TFA, talk about a large number of estates where we've had very spiky conversations with them. And over time, those estates have become much better landlords as a result. And some of them have been kind enough to say that our input as an organization has been beneficial to that extent, those spiky conversations that we've had. but it is really, really helpful when we have good landlords, both Alistair and Paul demonstrating that tonight, but others are out there as well.
Yeah.
We can show good practice, and we can just use that as a contrast for those who are not following good practice.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm sure that's right. I'm sure it's a step. It's like a step, a change. It's not a step change. Rather, it's climbing up a ladder slowly, isn't it? I think that's the thing. I mean, similar topic, but slightly moving on in terms of sort of farming practices. JJ Wilcox asks, and I'm interested, Paul, particularly in your answer to this. I'm not sure whether this is something that's been done at the Duchy, Alistair, but Paul certainly mentioned that, he's happy to take a lower rent where farming practices were different. And JJ asks, how does one engage a traditional landlord and his land agent in regen farming practices and the obvious benefit to the land, and encourage them to take a compromise in a lower rent for the tenant? Which is obviously something you're looking at, Paul, or doing. I don't know, Alistair, how you've managed that where you're encouraged regenerative practices, but it's clearly a direction of travel that we're all being encouraged to head in. So, and there is a bit of a penalty possibly in the, over time. So I wonder what your answers to that would be.
Yeah. So Mark, what we have done is, when all the farms we've relet over the last, I think, 5 years now, we've relet with a memorandum of understanding, which is appended to the agreement, which sets out some regenerative farming guidance. And they've been, before we've invited tenders for rent, the applicants have seen that. So we have consciously taken softer rents now for several years in order to move towards a more regenerative future. I mean, if you wanted to ask me how much, I'd say a typical Duchy farm where our rents aren't as high anyway as I suspect the Crown rents are, we have typically, I would say, taken 30, 40, maybe sometimes £50 less, depending on the extent to which the farming practice is inhibited if those restrictions weren't there. So it's also, Mark, something we recognise going forward when we work with our farm tenants for them to move to a more regenerative farming system. We completely acknowledge that softening rents is going to be, one of the tools in the toolbox. It's inevitable. We can't instruct them how to do it. We can if we let a new farm, we obviously can impose it, but we certainly can't impose it on existing tenancies. But no, we do exist. We don't have our environmental FBT model that the Crown have got. We're all approach this in a slightly different way. That we're approaching it on a much more farm by farm basis. But we absolutely acknowledge that we are our top line is going to be less, certainly in the medium term because of that. But at a time when we can start monetizing the benefits from net zero, my earnest hope and what I've said to my principals is that I think there will be an income stream at an estate level that we haven't had before. But we've got to get to net zero first, and it's a long-term game.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, no, I totally subscribe to that. I think the challenge for us is, and it doesn't work on every estate we own because of geographical location, but the diversification income that I touched on in our sort of pillar one of asset management and unlocking that at scale creates this income stacking that I was talking about. It takes away the resilience, the reliance on primary agricultural production and subsidy to try and make the businesses more diverse. And if you look at it, a landlord's perspective, that's what they've been doing for generations. They've been making their estates more diverse. I remember starting years ago as a resident agent where the estate income, sort of 60% came from farm rents. If you look at the same estate today, it's probably 20% because of the rise in residential and commercial opportunities. And we've simply taken the view that we will promote our environmental FBTs for right environmental outcomes, quite accepting that may deliver a lower rent. And, the figures that Alistair has spoken about, we've seen sort of tendered for the environmental farm business tenancy. But the drive in diversification across the farm far outweighs any downturn in farm rents. So it's a win-win for both sides. But that comes down to this change in mindset, both from us, our agents, and our farmers, to having that willingness to have a go.
Yeah, no, and I think it's really good to hear that that there is just that understanding, isn't it, of what the different, it's not all about the rent. There's lots of other stuff that can play into this to make the overall individual farm and the overall estate a successful, viable business, both for the tenant and for the landlord. So yeah, no, that's really good to hear. As usual, I've completely failed to keep an eye on the time, so we're over time already now. We've also failed miserably, as always, to ask all the questions, but I hope that we'll be able to put some of these and answer them offline. Julia, as ever, will do her magic and put them on the website, the answers. So please come back and take a look at those. For those of you that have asked questions that haven't got answered, apologies. But we will do our best to get you answers to those. So a really big thank you to Alistair and Paul for coming along this evening. I think it's been a very uplifting Christmas message, actually, that these things do work and there are people out there, and we will all have other examples. I think it's there are good examples all over the place, and we mustn't get sort of too bad about poor relationships, but I think you are really exemplars, I think, in the industry of what people can actually achieve, both from a tenant and a landlord perspective. And I'm going to just read out a comment that we've had from Robert Sturdy, because I think, and you should maybe just read all the comments before you go, because it might make you'll show how grateful we are that you've given your time up. But Robert says, "There's no consistency in the management of the relationship. This is an incredible discussion. It makes me feel emotional. We now need to ensure that these positive messages are bottled and become the norm for all landlords and tenants, irrespective of scale. These guys have the power to make a change and set the precedent." So somebody's a happy man going into Christmas. So that's really good to hear. And there's others like that. So yeah, thank you both very much for giving up your time and joining us this evening. For those of you that want to go back and listen to this again, as I say, it is on our YouTube channel, and the answers will be on the website. Just a reminder that our next webinar is on the 24th of January, diving deeper into soil carbon issues with guest speaker Tom Tolput, who's the farm consultant at Terra Farmer. So again, think of questions or come along and we're in this whole soil carbon area these days, so anything we can learn on that is always good to hear. So that's on the usual time, 7 o'clock, 24th of January. All I need to do is to say once again a big thank you to Alistair and Paul and George for joining us this evening. To wish you all, and thank Oxbury, of course, for sponsoring our webinars. Really grateful to that. And to wish you all a very happy Christmas and a much drier new year, let's hope, because it can't get any wetter, surely. As someone farming with some of the land below sea level, I think I realise why it's below sea level. It's coming back. It's we're seeing what it was like 200 years ago as a marshland. So hopefully 24 will be drier. So anyway, happy Christmas to everybody, and go and enjoy the rest of your evening.